Hi everyone, welcome to the Community Classroom. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator, and we're going to be talking today about making Indigenous, Aboriginal, original, and Native identity invisible. And so we're going to be looking at this from the perspective of the shell game, the same shell game that we've been talking about regarding playing around with names to hide the identities of entities and changing the names of actual places, geographic places. And so we're going to look at that whole issue in the context of Aboriginal, original, Indigenous, Native American, Indian people. And as we explore this issue, one of the things that I want to encourage people to do is to start to sort of increase that inductive and deductive reasoning when digesting material about understanding your ethnicity, understanding your ancestry, understanding the context of all of that in the Americas and as a part of the globe, both past and present. And in order to do this effectively, individuals have to be very, very careful about avoiding narcissism. So we've been talking a lot about narcissism with good reason, because it permeates so many things and it increases difficulty when people are trying to negotiate the world. And so part of avoiding narcissism is not assuming that your identity, your ethnicity, your ancestry, your vantage point is everyone else's. And we keep talking about that, but the issue continues to come up. And it usually comes up, they're sort of splinter groups, so to speak. So you have individuals who are very, very, very focused on Pan-Africanism and want everyone to be focused on Pan-Africanism. Then you have what's known as the conscious community, whether they're Pan-Africanist or not, and they want everyone to be in that community and believe that everyone should be, and if people are not, they're some sort of traitor. Then you have individuals who are in the descendants of American chattel slavery collective, and that is the focus, and oftentimes a desire to push aside the Pan-African perspective and the indigenous perspective. And then you have the indigenous community who might often dismiss the fact that some people did actually come over to the Americas via some other way than being indigenous. And so there are a lot of different splinters going on. And in order to be effective in your research and understanding your own history, it's important to just own your history and let other people own their history, because your plate, if you're doing this right, your plate's going to be full. And so who we're going to focus on is Chief Warhorse. And not just her specifically, but we're going to focus on this issue of erasing identity and how the identity of Indians in the Southeast, how that identity has been erased, how the identity of Indians in the Northeast, in the Mid-Atlantic region, how there have been attempts to erase their identity. And part of that erasure of identity has come from and grown out of both Eurocentrism and Afrocentrism. Now, there have been a number of commentaries coming from multiple directions about the issue of brown Americans identifying as American Indians, as identifying as the indigenous people of this particular geographic locale. And a part of this, not just a part, a large part of this, has to do with skin color. A lot of this has to do with people having a narrative in their head based upon whatever it is they learn from their first, second, third, and fourth grade teachers about what American Indians look like and what slaves look like. And so this is what this really comes down to. There is a belief that American Indians look a particular way, and there's a belief that American slaves looked a particular way. There's a belief that quote unquote African Americans look a particular way, and that quote unquote American Indians or Aboriginal Americans or Native Americans, that they look a particular way. And so when people buy into the narrative about the way that people are supposed to look, and they believe that the way people look dictates whatever their ancestry is, they will often get caught up, and they will often attempt to deny people their ancestry, deny people their identity, and then instead place on them an identity that is not even their own. And I said all that to say the narrative is basically this: if someone does not look stereotypically white or stereotypically Asian, then the belief for many people is that those individuals could not possibly be Indigenous Americans. They could not possibly be Native. They could not possibly be the actual American Indians. There is no understanding of the diversity of the tribes that have existed here on this space since before any colonist ever arrived, before Columbus ever arrived, before any Africans ever came across those shores. Chief Warhorse is not only a chief, she is also a queen. She's queen of the Tchefunctia Nation. And one of the things that happens is when people are ignorant of the history of the Americas, they're ignorant of the history of Indians, they do not have a complete understanding of the narrative of that heritage. They misunderstand things and then will dismiss things that do not fit with their narrative. And so you might have individuals saying, oh, this is a hoax. These people, they're pretendians, all sorts of derogatory names that people are given when they own their indigenous heritage. And the fact of the matter is that the average Joe walking down the street may not recognize that this is a bona fide American Indian indigenous group, but the United States government recognizes them. Even though they might not have been among the group that left with the 5 civilized tribes, they are still understood as indigenous. They are still understood as having been here prior to any colonists ever arriving. And so not only do you have the United States government understanding this, you have the state of Louisiana understanding this and recognizing their native tribes. And in this instance, Chief Warhorse has worked diligently, not only with her own Indian people, she has worked diligently for human rights and civil rights with a variety of groups. And so she has assisted a number of groups in terms of their civil rights and human rights efforts. She's worked across religious lines, she's worked across tribal lines, she's worked across color lines, and so she's done it all. She has been a phenomenal chief. But what many people see when they see her is a quote unquote black woman. What many people see when they see her is this assumption that she is an African American woman, that she came over during the slave trade to the Americas, and that is the crux of her identity. And people, when they make those assumptions, they make wrong assumptions. And it's really interesting because the individuals who tend to make these wrong assumptions are also individuals who tend to say that they've been miseducated in the public school systems. And in understanding that they may have been miseducated in the public school systems, they probably also need to understand that part of that miseducation is a historical miseducation. And there needs to be space made for understanding other narratives in terms of understanding reality. And part of that reality is knowing that the Choctaw Indians are buried in this particular cemetery in Bayou Lacombe, Louisiana. It is a beautiful cemetery. It is a very old cemetery, and it's actually a family cemetery. And a number of the family members are Creole. And the Choctaw Indians are buried in some of these lighted plots that you see. And they're usually identified by those Maltese crosses. Now, cemeteries and death records are wonderful ways to trace your heritage. And so, if you recognize that your name traces back to a particular region of the United States, you might want to actually take a trip to that region and see if you can meet people who might share your same surname. And you might find some relatives that you didn't even know existed. You might want to go to some of the cemeteries, like the one that was just shown, to see if you see any indicia of your heritage in there. One of the things that has happened with this making Indigenous identity invisible is stealing their identity, basically. And so there has been the stealing of their land, the stealing of their legacy, and then the stealing of their actual identity, and then appropriating that identity and conflating that identity with identities that are not their own. So they have been variously called everything from quadroon to Moor to savage to slave to mulatto to freeman to colored persons to Negroes to black. And actually the most egregious identity that many of them have been given is African American. The other identities are basic identifiers based upon characteristics. African American, however, actually steals their identity and places them on another continent. This isn't about being the descendant of a particular people. This is about actually saying that somebody came from a continent that they don't understand themselves as coming from. And so saying that they are African American is saying basically that they were brought here by the colonizers. And can you imagine the significance of telling someone that it's not their land, that they are the interlopers, that they were enslaved and that's how they got here? That whatever it is that their grandparents told them about how they got here is wrong. And whatever those first, second, third, and fourth grade teachers told them about how they got here is correct. Whatever Pan-Africanists are telling them is correct. Whatever other entity is telling them about who they are is correct versus what they understand themselves to be. Just imagine if another country were to take over another country, and they would suddenly tell the people that live there that they are no longer the original people from that place. Instead, they want to give them the identity of the colonizers, whoever the colonizers are. Or in the alternative, they want to give them the identity of someone who is not even related to them or the colonizer in terms of nationality, or in terms of continent affiliation. And so basically that is what has happened with the indigenous people of America who have brown skin. Because if they did not have brown skin, they would have already been readily, easily, eagerly accepted as what they already are and what they already know they are. And so for someone to insist that the Choctaw are actually the Yoruba, or they are the Fon, or they are the Igbo, or they are the Akan, is disrespect at the least. And then it is egregious and unconscionable at the worst. It is a theft of identity anytime you call someone something other than what they are. In all of this moving around and all of this migrating, people get lost. People get lost in the shuffle. Now, whether or not that's an intended dynamic or it's simply a consequence of a natural occurrence is debatable, given the fact that the relocation of the Choctaw was not a completely voluntary dynamic. There is the suggestion that some of this confusion is by design. Some of the shell game is by design. Splitting up entire tribes and nations is by design. And what it does is it makes people disconnected, and it confuses those identities when you split those people up. And so one of the things that you have to do when you're trying to understand your heritage, trying to trace your ancestry, you're going to have to use inductive and deductive reasoning. So you're going to have to cross-reference a lot. You're going to have to keep your eyes and ears open. When you see something that sounds similar, follow that path. You'd be amazed at what you might find. And so one of the things that someone might miss when they are talking about different place names, and it's very interesting because if you're not familiar with a particular place, you might not, that red flag might not go off for you when you see a particular place name that's been adjusted or altered in some sort of way. And this is what has happened in terms of the Oklahoma Choctaw and the Southeast Choctaw. It's the same thing that happened in this instance. And so if you look on the screen, you'll see that there is a state park in the Louisiana state park system. And it, if you look at it, it's kind of, it has a French, it's been turned into a Francophone type of dynamic there, but it is from the Choctaw language. And it basically means big creek. And so when you see it, it looks like Bogchito, but it is basically Bocachita. And so when you look at this, you might not recognize when you see the equivalent of it in Oklahoma. Similarly, when you see Bogafalaya, when you see that river, it might not register to you that there's something in Oklahoma that is substantially similar. But when you see what's in Oklahoma, and we're going to see this on the screen in a minute, you'll see these connections that you're going to have to learn how to make on your own if you're going to make these connections in terms of understanding your ancestry and tracing where people may have gone to. And so many people might not make that connection between Southeast Louisiana and Oklahoma, but the connection is there, and the connection is often in the language. And so you see, you have this place that's in Louisiana, it's in Washington Parish, a place called Franklinton. And that's, if you're in New Orleans, if you've ever been to New Orleans, this would be north of New Orleans, so it's considered the North Shore. And so then you look below and you see the Bogafalaya River. Again, this is north of New Orleans across the causeway. And it's a tribute to, it's related to the Tchefunctia River. And so you can remember Chief Warhorse, and here we have the Tchefunctia River that is related to Lake Pontchartrain. And so you have these two entities with these names, and these names come from Choctaw words. It looks a little French, but it comes from Choctaw words. And so just hold on to that. And remember, as far as we know, this is where the Choctaw, this is their home base, is the southeastern portion of the United States. And so you may have a number of Choctaw who have been recognized federally as a civilized Indian tribe. You might have them in Oklahoma, and they may have left behind their quote-unquote uncivilized browner brethren in Louisiana, in Southeast United States. But when you look on the screen, you can see that you can run, but you can't hide. Okay, so when you look and you see Bocachito, Oklahoma, or Bocchita, Oklahoma, a red flag should go off for you. And you should almost automatically think in terms of tracing this heritage to Louisiana. If you are not familiar with Louisiana, however, it may not just jump out at you. But if you are familiar with Louisiana in any way, shape, form, or fashion, this is going to jump out at you almost immediately. And you're going to see the connection without ever knowing that this place in Oklahoma is related in any way to the Choctaw Nation. Your mind is automatically going to go to St. Tammany Parish. And your mind's automatically going to go to Washington Parish. And so these are the things that you need to be looking out for when you are trying to tie things together, when you're trying to uncover some of those identities that have been hidden or have been obscured. And so one of the things that this narrative that goes on is that in many instances when they are trying to hide, when someone is trying to hide the identity of a group, they will change the names, they will change the locations, people will get grafted in and people will get grafted out. And no matter how much you graft people in and graft people out and change locations and change place names, it's not going to change who the people are. And there will be some thread, some common thread, some shred of evidence is going to be there that's going to link you to your ancestors, to your extended family. There's going to be a thread there. You just have to be on the lookout for it. And for those who are tracing their heritage in Africa, you're going to have to do the same thing because what has been noted is that they've even been, people who've been playing around with these maps and things, they've even been more clever when it comes to changing the names and locations of people related to the transatlantic slave trade and related to a number of things that took place in Europe in relation to America. So you're going to have to keep your eyes and your ears open. You cannot be, if you're trying to get to the truth and you're trying to understand who you are and you're trying to understand history, not just yours, but other history, you have to keep your mind open. You cannot get caught up in being colorist, whether we're talking about colorist where you're thinking everybody must be the same color as you in order to be related to you. Everybody must be a particular color to fit into this particular cultural group. If you get caught up in that, you're going to get caught up and you are never going to find the truth. The truth is going to be elusive. The truth is going to be evasive. You are not going to find it. And so you have to open your mind up and you have to be ready to accept a number of narratives that may compete with the narratives given to you by your first, second, and third grade teachers who probably didn't study any of this. And this gives you an idea, and this is a really good idea, of how names, place names change over time, or how people change place names over time. Some of the changing is surely, probably innocent, but some of it maybe not so. And some of it also is involved with colonization. And so when a new colonizer comes in, they may change things to fit with whatever their narrative might be, and they may also change things according to their language. For instance, in some languages, there's no J. And so, if someone comes and they have a language with a J in it, they'll insert the J into someone else's language. And so it gets things very confusing. And so this is the Bogafilaya River. And when you look at this, you look to the side, to the left, you see all of these different iterations of that name. And if you are not really tuned in, you may miss that it's talking about the same river. And so therefore you may not follow a particular lead because it didn't look exactly the way you thought it was supposed to look. One of the places where they've done this, for those of you who are doing your research in Africa, one of the places that they've done this more than probably any place known is that place named Huda, Wuda, Judah, Wida, that they played around with so much. And we're going to get into that also in the future. But that's one of those places where they have definitely played with the name and it looks very intentional. And so here you have some different iterations which really look like, people might have just been spelling it different. Some of it might have been mistakes. And then some of it looks like you've got a total change in language in one of those, because it's more of a Hispanic variation. And when you think about Louisiana, that heritage is both French and Spanish. And so you might see that along with Indian and some African languages. And so you can see right here why you need to be on the lookout for that, because there are many instances where the changing of the name will create confusion and sort of throw you off track. And you have to figure out how to stay on track by keeping your eyes and ears open for noticing similarities, noticing those common threads. Now let's talk about this final issue here. Renaming something or someone does not change the core reality of a people. No matter how much you might want to believe that when someone has a particular skin color, they have a particular hair texture, that they definitely came from a particular African group, no matter how much you believe that, it does not necessarily make it so. You cannot simply take a person who is Choctaw, like the women on the screen, and insist that they are perhaps Igbo, perhaps Fon, perhaps Yoruba, perhaps Akan, perhaps Hausa, perhaps Fulani. You cannot simply do that. You don't know that. And oftentimes what is happening in Afrocentrism is a form of narcissism, and people making the assumption that when someone identifies themselves as American Indian, it is because they have some self-esteem problem and they don't want to identify with their African roots. They don't have African roots as you understand African roots to be in most instances. They do not have a connection in terms of coming over on a boat in a slave trade. That's not their narrative. That's not their history. And so it is egregious to continue to demand that those individuals take on an identity that is not theirs. It is an identity that many people who identify as African American can't easily take on, because no matter how much DNA testing a person does, that DNA testing is not going to link them to a particular ancestor that was in Africa at a particular time. It's not going to link them back in that way. And so there will be other ways that people will need to start finding their ancestors that were in Africa, but insisting that someone else take on the identity of another group is a form of narcissism. And the other thing that it does is a number of things that have taken place in terms of slavery in the United States. The individuals who were enslaved were often the people that you identify as Native American Indian. They were enslaved. And so when they are then given that new identity of African American, it allows other people to come into the space known as America and take on vicariously that American Indian identity by proxy and by extension, because the American Indians, the brown American Indians, have been renamed so many times that one of the renamings involved being called African American. And so you have a situation where individuals who are Native Africans taking on the identity of Native Americans because that connector term was created of African and American, and it is completely inappropriate. And one of the other things it's important to remember is that when people are engaged in identity theft, changing someone else's identity, taking on their identity, it is for no other purpose than to have some sort of gain. It is for no other purpose than to avoid being detected in terms of doing something wrong. Think about any type of identity theft. If someone takes your social security number, they are not usually doing it for benevolent reasons. They are usually doing it to hide something about who they are, or they are doing it to gain something related to taking on your identity. And so you can see how this whole process is egregious, and it is a part of erasing the identity of the indigenous people here in the Americas. One of the last things I want you to think about is this. Oftentimes you hear the narrative that the American Indians were enslaved first, and it was very difficult to keep them enslaved, of course, on their own land. And particularly when you're talking about Louisiana, you hear about all of this, hard slave labor that went on in Louisiana, but there were parts of Louisiana where it was almost impossible to keep someone enslaved because of the bayous, just like the Seminole Indians down in Alligator Alley. It was very difficult to keep them enslaved because they would run off into the swampland. They knew the land. It was their land. Same thing was going on in parts of Louisiana like St. Tammany Parish. And so one of the things that has taken place is that people have forgotten that, and this is that inductive, deductive reasoning thing, people have forgotten that part of the narrative of history is that when the Africans that did come over, when they came over, they often ran to American Indian tribes, and those tribes hid them. They hid among the tribes. They were taken into the tribes. Common sense should send up this red flag. In order for someone to hide among someone and go undetected, there would have to be a similarity. And that similarity was likely skin color. And that skin color was sufficiently similar to allow them to avoid easy detection. And when you look at many of the people who identify as Native American who are out west and some in the south, southeast, clearly it would be very, very difficult for many individuals of African descent to have hid among them, to have gone undetected, to have been incorporated. If you ever listen to any of the music of the Mardi Gras Indians, they tell the story, they hold that oral tradition of what happened for Africans in relation to the Indians. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.